Capture of Weather Stations. Part 1. The Ghosts in the Ice. The intelligence, when it finally reached the cold, linoleum-floored office of Lieutenant Commander Edward Teddy Fleming in the bowels of the Admiralty in London, was both infuriating and electrifying. A decoded intercept from Bletchley Park, coupled with a grainy, high-altitude reconnaissance photo from a modified Mosquito, revealed the truth. On the desolate, glacier-carved coast of Nordaustlandet, part of the Svalbard archipelago deep inside the Arctic Circle, the Germans weren't just hiding. They were watching. The photo showed not a military base, but a cluster of low, snow-drifted huts, a radio mast, and a windsock. A weather station. A weather station. From this frozen hell, a handful of men were sending the data that was killing Fleming's countrymen. Their barometric readings and wind charts were helping U-boats evade Atlantic convoy hunts and giving the Luftwaffe precious hours of warning for RAF bombing raids. The weather was the one front where the Allies were perpetually blindsided, and these frozen outposts were the enemy's eyes. Fleming, a former mountaineer and a veteran of the brutal commando raids in Norway, was tasked with designing the antidote. The project was given a suitably cryptic and ominous name: Operation Strange. Its mandate was simple, insane, and unprecedented. Seek out and destroy the Führer's Arctic Sentinels. This would not be a naval bombardment or a massed assault. It would be a series of surgical, high-risk raids into the most hostile environment on Earth, targeting the most isolated enemy positions of the war. The men Fleming recruited were ghosts themselves, drawn from the margins of the armed forces. There was Captain James Mac McAndrew, a dour, formidable Scot from the Lovett Scouts who could stalk a deer across bare rock and had spent a winter trapping in the Yukon. His second was Lieutenant Lars Nansen, a Norwegian commando with the exiled Milorg, who had grown up skiing the Hardangervidda Plateau and whose family had been killed in the German occupation. His motivation was a cold, silent flame. They were joined by a handful of others: a Canadian bush pilot who could read ice like a map, a Royal Engineer who was a genius with explosives in sub-zero conditions, and two wiry Welsh miners who feared no confined dark space, be it a tunnel or a submarine. Their training was a descent into a specialized madness. On the frozen slopes of the Scottish Cairngorms, in the perpetual drizzle and howling wind, they practiced assaulting mock-ups of the German huts. They learned to move silently on skis with white canvas over their uniforms, their faces blackened with grease. They rehearsed scaling ice cliffs with pitons and ropes, and making perilous zodiac landings from imaginary submarines onto rocky, surf-pounded shores in the dead of night. They studied German weather equipment, learning which wires to cut, which crystals in the radios to smash, and which code books to seize. Their most vital lesson was survival. How to build an ice cave, how to avoid frostbite when your sweat could freeze you to death, how to signal for extraction when the Arctic darkness or a whiteout could swallow you whole. They were not just commandos. They were becoming polar wraiths. Their first target, codenamed Strange Eye, was the station on the island of Bear Island, Bjørnøya, a jagged rock in the Barents Sea roughly halfway between Norway and Svalbard. Intelligence suggested a manned station of 8-10 men. The tool for insertion was as unconventional as the team: the HMS Truculent, a T-class submarine specially modified for Arctic operations. For 10 days, the team endured the claustrophobic, diesel-scented world of the sub, playing endless hands of cards, checking and rechecking their gear as the Truculent slipped beneath the pack ice. On a night where the sun merely dimmed to a twilight glow at midnight, they emerged. The launch was a nightmare of cold so intense it stole the breath. The rubber dinghy, black against the leaden water, fought through chop that sprayed instantly into ice on their goggles. They landed on a shingle beach beneath cliffs glazed with ice, the only sound the crunch of their boots on frozen stone and the distant groan of shifting pack ice. McAndrew led the way up a treacherous gully. For 6 hours, they moved like shadows, the diffuse light playing tricks on their eyes. They found the station nestled in a shallow valley. Through his binoculars, Mac saw a man in a greatcoat emerge from a hut, urinate a steaming arc into the snow, and shuffle back inside. The casual normalcy of it in this alien landscape was chilling. The assault at dawn was swift and brutal. As the station's cook stepped out to fetch ice for meltwater, Nansen's knife found its mark. The Welsh miners blew the generator hut door with a focused charge that sounded like a cough in the vast silence. Mac and the others stormed the main hut. The fight was short, desperate, and fought in a confusion of down sleeping bags, overturned tables, and the stark glare of petrol lamps. 2 Germans were killed, 5 surrendered, stunned by the impossibility of the attack. The engineer set his charges on the radio mast and the delicate Wetter-Funkgerät instruments. As the team retreated to the extraction point with their prisoners and a sack of seized codebooks and logs, a series of satisfying crumps echoed through the valley. A pillar of black smoke rose, a stark, defiant stain against the Arctic white. Strange. I was a success, but as the exhausted, frozen men were hauled back into the steel belly of the truculent, they knew this was just the beginning. They had stolen the enemy's spectacles, but the enemy had many more pairs, hidden in even more terrifying places. Part 2. The Kingdom of the White Death. The success of Strange. I was a spike of adrenaline in the veins of the Allied High Command, but for Fleming's team, now officially dubbed the Special Arctic Service, it was a lesson in scale. Bear Island was a doorstep. The true citadels of the German weather war lay further north, in the heart of the Svalbard archipelago, on islands with names like Nordaustlandet and Spitsbergen, realms of howling katabatic winds, permanent ice caps, and a darkness in winter that was absolute and suffocating. The next target, Strange 2, was the most audacious yet. A station suspected to be on the Princess Martha coast of Nordaustlandet, a place so remote and brutal it was known only to polar bears and the most hardened trappers. This station, however, was believed to be more than just a weather outpost. Signals intelligence hinted it might be a relay node, a hub for data from automated stations deeper in the ice, and possibly even a control point for a new, more resilient type of automated weather buoy the Germans were seeding in the Greenland Sea. It had to be captured, its secrets extracted intact. This time, insertion would not be by submarine. The pack ice was too thick, the coast too treacherous. The tool would be a Halifax bomber, specially stripped and equipped with long-range fuel tanks and skis. The plan was for a high-altitude, low-opening halo parachute drop onto the ice cap inland, followed by a multi-day ski march to the coast. It was a plan that bordered on suicide. McAndrew, Nansen, and a new volunteer, a young American OSS officer and former Olympic skier named Eric Thorvald, found themselves crammed into the freezing fuselage of the Halifax as it droned north from a secret base in Iceland. The world below transformed from gray ocean to a fractured mosaic of white and blue ice, then to the sheer, terrifying whiteness of the ice cap. At 18,000 feet, the jump light flicked from red to green. The wind roar as the hatch opened was a physical beast. They jumped into a void, the plane vanishing instantly into the starry night. The freefall was a silent, breathtaking plummet through air so cold it felt like glass shards in the lungs. At 3,000 feet, they pulled their chutes, the sudden jerk a shocking return to weight and sound. They landed with soft crunches on a snowfield as hard as concrete, under a canopy of stars so vivid and close they felt tangible. The next 72 hours were a purgatory of cold and exertion. Hauling heavy sleds, pulkas, laden with gear, they navigated by sextant and dead reckoning across a featureless plain, the horizon a white line against a black sky. The cold was a living entity. It seeped through their multiple layers of wool and fur, made every metal item, a knife, a binocular case, a brand of frostbite. They moved in a cocoon of their own breathing, the moisture freezing on their balaclavas into stiff, icy masks. They slept in shifts in a single shared tent, heating water on a Primus stove for tepid drinks that were the difference between life and a fatal drop in core temperature. On the third day, Nansen, scouting ahead on skis, signaled a halt. He had found the station. It was not a cluster of huts, but a single, long, low structure, half buried in a snowdrift, with a skeletal radio mast guyed against the eternal wind. A thin plume of smoke rose from a chimney pipe. It looked less like a military installation and more like a desperate refuge. The assault plan was simple: speed and overwhelming force at the moment of maximum vulnerability. They waited until just before the scheduled morning weather transmission, when the operator would be at his radio. Covered in white snow smocks, they ghosted down the final slope. Thorvald and the Canadian took up overwatch positions. Mac and Nansen, with the two Welsh miners, approached the main door. There was no need for explosives. The door, warped by frost, was merely barred from the inside. A single, well-placed kick from Mac's frozen boot splintered the frame. They burst in. The scene inside was surreal. The air was thick with the smells of tobacco, unwashed bodies, and stewed cabbage. 4 Germans, pale and bearded, stared up from a table littered with cards and dirty mugs. A 5th was hunched over a humming Hellschreiber weather teletype. For a second, there was only the howl of the wind in the broken doorway. Then Nansen shouted in flawless German, "Hands up! The station is captured. Do not touch the equipment." The fight, what little there was extinguished by sheer shock. These were not elite troops. They were Wettertruppen, weather troops scientists, technicians, and conscripts who drew the Arctic straw. Their commander, a gaunt Feldwebel with haunted eyes, simply sighed and placed his hands on the table. "Wir haben schon lange auf euch gewartet," he said quietly. "We have been waiting for you for a long time." While the prisoners were secured, the team's engineer fell upon the equipment. This was the prize. He didn't destroy it. He began to meticulously photograph every dial, every wiring diagram, every code book. He extracted the vital quartz crystals from the transmitter. Nansen interrogated the Feldwebel, who, in his relief at being captured and perhaps in a flicker of scientific camaraderie, revealed the locations and call signs of 3 automated Wetterfunkgerät land stations along the coast. He drew a rough map on the back of a chart. Their work done, they planted explosive charges on the transmitter and the generator. But before triggering them, McAndrew did something unexpected. He had the prisoners dressed in their warmest gear. They would not be left to freeze. They would be taken with them on a grueling ski march back to the prearranged extraction point on the ice cap, where a daring Catalina flying boat would attempt a landing on a marked lead in the pack ice. As they filed out into the blinding white, the charges detonated behind them. The station, the Führer's lonely eye on the top of the world, died not with a fiery bang, but with a muffled thump swallowed by snow and ice. They had not just destroyed a station. They had harvested its intelligence and taken its soul. The long march back, now with prisoners in tow, began. The kingdom of the White Death had been breached. Part 3. The War of the Machines and the Legacy of Ice Operation Strange evolved. The raids on manned stations like those on Bear Island and Nordost-Landed were spectacular successes, but they were akin to swatting mosquitoes. The Germans, adaptive and technologically brilliant, pivoted. They began deploying more of the Wetterfunkgerät Land, WFL, the fully automated weather stations. These were ingenious, devilish devices, stout, watertight cylinders packed with instruments, a radio transmitter, and banks of batteries, designed to broadcast encoded weather data for months without human intervention. They were dropped by U-boats or placed by small teams in locations so remote and inhospitable that a manned station was impossible. They were the perfect Arctic sentinel, requiring no food, feeling no fear, and immune to the cold. Strange 3, therefore, had a new objective, not just to destroy, but to deceive. The target, Codenamed Kobold by German naval intelligence, was an automated station suspected to be on the eastern coast of Greenland. Fleming's team, reinforced with a signals intelligence officer, was tasked with a heist. They were to capture the Kobold, not to silence it, but to turn it. Using the technical schematics and codes seized in Strange Thaw 2, they would rewire it to transmit false weather data, poisoning the German forecasting stream at its source. The insertion this time was a masterpiece of combined operations. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter, the Northland, posing as a weather observation ship, navigated the marginal ice zone. From it, the team launched in a small boat to a pre-scouted fjord. For 2 days, using direction-finding equipment, they triangulated the Kobold's telltale automated signal. A brief, repetitive burst of data on a precise frequency. They found it nestled in a rock cleft, painted to look like stone, its antenna a slim whip of steel. Under the spectral glow of the Arctic night's twilight, the signals officer and the engineer went to work. It was a nerve-wracking task conducted with frozen fingers, using miniature tools by the light of shielded lanterns. They had to open the casing without triggering any anti-tamper devices, of which there were none, a critical German oversight born of arrogance. Disconnect the actual sensor inputs, and wire in a pre-programmed sequencer that would broadcast plausible but utterly false data that would suggest a persistent high-pressure system where a deadly storm was gathering, or calm seas where gales were building. For 48 hours, the Kobold went silent. In the German headquarters in Tromsø, Norway, this would be noted as a probable equipment failure due to the extreme cold a common occurrence. When its signal resumed, the data flow was steady, credible, and a complete fabrication. The poison was in the stream. The success of Strange 3 marked the zenith of the secret Arctic War. The Allies had moved from destruction to active deception. They had turned the enemy's own weapons against him. Subsequent operations became a mix of continued hunter-killer raids against any manned stations and sophisticated electronic warfare against the automated network. The legacy of Operation Strange and its sister missions was profound, though written in ice and soon forgotten by broader history. By D-Day in June 1944, the German advantage in Arctic weather data had been critically eroded. Their picture of the North Atlantic was fuzzy, incomplete, and in some cases deliberately corrupted. When Group Captain James Stagg made his fateful forecast for a 36-hour break in the Channel storms on June 6th, he did so with slightly less fear of a superior German prediction. The chaos they had sown in the Arctic data stream helped create the cloak of surprise that covered the Normandy landings. For the men of the Special Arctic Service, there were no parades. They returned to their units or vanished into civilian life, their bodies marked by frostbite, their minds forever holding the echo of the Arctic silence and the memory of a war fought not for miles of ground, but for millibars of pressure and degrees of temperature. They had fought in a theater where the enemy was not just the soldier in gray, but the cold that could kill in minutes, the ice that could shatter a hull, and the wind that could erase a man from existence. They proved that in total war, no front is too remote, no asset too esoteric to be contested. The battle for the weather was won not only by scientists in warm map rooms, but by commandos on frozen skis, men who became ghosts in the ice to blind the enemy, and, in doing so, helped illuminate the path to victory. Their war was one of utter silence, broken only by the crunch of skis, the crack of a rifle in the crystalline air, and the electronic whisper of a captured machine, now telling lies for the cause of freedom.